Cop tries to remove black woman from private jet. She's an international ambassador on a mission. What's a woman like you doing here? The officer sneered, his gaze fixed on the elegant black woman standing calmly by the private jet terminal. Her passport and documents sat untouched on the counter, dismissed as if they carried no weight. You don't belong here, he added, his tone laced with condescension. The woman didn't flinch. She stood tall, her presence commanding even as whispers spread among the onlookers. Who was she? What was she doing here? And why wasn't she reacting to the blatant humiliation? What the officer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they were trying to remove wasn't just any passenger. She was Ambassador Maya Johnson, on a mission of global significance, and the actions they were about to take would have consequences none of them could foresee. What happens when ignorance collides with power and prejudice meets justice? This is the story of a reckoning they never saw coming. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling private jet terminal, where sleek jets gleamed like polished silver arrows against the azure sky. Maya Johnson stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the smooth pavement. She adjusted her sunglasses and took a steadying breath. The day ahead wasn't just important, it was critical. Lives depended on the mission she carried in the weighty diplomatic briefcase clutched in her hand. Her entrance was unassuming, deliberate even. She knew blending in often served her better than standing out. Yet her presence commanded a quiet dignity, one not easily ignored. As she made her way toward the glass doors of the terminal, whispers began to ripple among the waiting staff and travelers. Who's she? She doesn't look like the private jet type. Bet she's in the wrong place. Maya heard the murmurs but didn't react. Years in diplomacy had taught her to let unwarranted judgment roll off her back like water off a polished stone. Inside the terminal, the air was cool, the polished marble floors reflecting the bustle of travelers and staff moving with purpose. Her steps were measured as she approached the counter to confirm her boarding. "Good afternoon," she said in her low, calm voice, handing over her passport. The attendant, a young man with a crisp uniform and an unkind smirk, barely glanced at the document before his expression twisted. He peered at Maya over the rim of his glasses, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Maya raised an eyebrow but kept her composure. "Yes. I'm Ambassador Maya Johnson. I have clearance for the jet departing to Geneva." The attendant's smirk didn't falter. "One moment," he said, tapping away at his computer. He paused, his fingers halting mid-keystroke. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but his skepticism returned almost instantly. He glanced over his shoulder and muttered to a colleague, loud enough for Maya to hear. "Think she's lost?" Maya remained silent, her posture straight and unwavering. The colleague, a stout woman with an exaggerated frown, approached the counter and scrutinized Maya as though she were an anomaly. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, her tone not bothering to mask her disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right terminal? This area is for private jet passengers." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. She pulled out a second document, a letter of clearance bearing the official seal of the United Nations, and laid it on the counter. The woman's eyes scanned the paper, her frown deepening. "Wait here," she snapped before striding away, leaving Maya standing alone, a spectacle for the growing number of curious onlookers. The murmur of voices rose. Maya caught fragments of their whispers. Why is she even here? Probably some mistake. Maybe she forged those papers. Her grip tightened around the handle of her briefcase, but her expression remained calm. She was no stranger to such moments. In rooms filled with world leaders, where her voice had to rise above layers of prejudice, she had learned to remain unshakable. Yet here, in this small terminal filled with petty assumptions, the sting of judgment was all too familiar. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the stout woman returned, accompanied by a man in uniform, Officer Kane. His tall frame loomed over the counter, and his sharp eyes scanned Maya from head to toe with a look that was far from professional. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gruff and authoritative, "we've had a report of suspicious activity. I need to see your identification." Maya tilted her head slightly. "You already have my passport and clearance letter. Is there a problem?" Kane leaned forward, his imposing frame intruding into her space. "I'll ask the questions here. Now, how did you get access to this terminal?" Maya's patience thinned, but her voice remained steady. "I've explained already. I'm Ambassador Maya Johnson, and I'm here for a scheduled flight. If there's an issue, I suggest you check with your superiors." Her words were calm, but the steel in her tone was unmistakable. Kane, however, seemed undeterred. He crossed his arms, his expression turning smug. "Listen, lady. You might be used to pulling this kind of stunt somewhere else, but not here. You don't belong in this terminal, and you're not boarding that jet." A cold silence fell over the room, the weight of his words sinking into the ears of everyone present. Maya could feel the stairs pressing against her back, the air thick with silent judgment and barely concealed disdain. For the first time, Maya's calm exterior cracked, just a fraction. Her gaze sharpened, and her voice, though still low, carried an edge that cut through the tension. "Officer," she said, her words deliberate, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your actions. You're making a mistake that could have significant consequences." Kane laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed through the terminal. "Oh, I'm the one making a mistake. Let's see about that." With that, he reached for the diplomatic briefcase. Maya's hand shot out, gripping the handle firmly. "You do not touch that," she said, her voice ice-cold. But Kane ignored her, prying the briefcase from her hand. The crowd gasped as Maya stood her ground, unflinching, her eyes locked on Kane with a defiance that made even the onlookers uneasy. The stage was set for what was to come, and Maya knew the storm was only beginning. The tension in the terminal was palpable, like the taut strings of a violin on the verge of snapping. Maya stood still, her hand now empty, as Officer Kane hoisted her diplomatic briefcase as though it were a trophy. His smirk widened, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of arrogance and triumph. For him this was more than an interrogation, it was a performance, and he relished every moment of his starring role. "I'll just take a look inside," Kane said with an exaggerated air of nonchalance, flipping the briefcase onto a nearby counter. "Let's see what you're so eager to hide." "You will regret this," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying a deadly calm that contrasted with the chaos brewing around her. The room seemed to shrink, every eye locked on the unfolding drama. Even the murmurs of the crowd died down, replaced by the sterile hum of the terminal's fluorescent lights. Kane ignored her warning. His fingers fumbled with the locks on the briefcase, a testament to his growing impatience. The metallic clicks echoed unnaturally loud in the room as the locks gave way, one after the other. Maya's posture remained firm, but inside, her frustration churned. Every second wasted here was a second stolen from the mission she was meant to complete. The terminal staff gathered at a cautious distance, their faces a patchwork of emotions, amusement, curiosity, and thinly veiled scorn. Some of the passengers whispered among themselves, leaning toward one another like conspirators sharing a secret. "Why doesn't she just leave? She's making this harder on herself. Bet she's hiding something." Maya's ears picked up the whispers, but her expression didn't betray her thoughts. Instead, she focused on Kane's every movement, calculating her next step. As the briefcase opened, revealing neatly organized documents, sealed envelopes, and a small electronic device marked with a United Nations emblem, a hush fell over the crowd. "What's this?" Kane sneered, plucking one of the documents from the case. He waved it in the air as if it were incriminating evidence. "Diplomatic nonsense! You really expect me to believe this?" Maya inhaled deeply, holding her composure like a shield. "Those are classified documents under international law. You're violating diplomatic protocol, Officer Kane. Put them back." Her words were deliberate, spoken with the precision of someone used to navigating crises. But Kane only chuckled, tossing the document back into the briefcase with deliberate carelessness. The turning point came when Kane reached for the electronic device. It was no larger than a smartphone, sleek and unassuming, but its significance was immeasurable. Maya's hand shot out instinctively, her grip closing around Kane's wrist before he could lift the device. "That is not for you," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Kane's face, but it was fleeting. He yanked his hand back, glaring at her with unmasked hostility. "Don't touch me," he barked, his voice rising enough to draw audible gasps from the crowd. "You think you can intimidate me? You're the one who's out of line." Maya stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, unflinching. "You've crossed every line, officer. You've ignored my identification, dismissed my credentials, and now you're tampering with protected property. This isn't just an abuse of power, it's a mistake you can't afford to make." Her words hit like a hammer, but Kane wasn't ready to back down. If anything, they fueled his resolve to assert his dominance. "Oh, I think I can afford it," he said, leaning in closer. "Because people like you always think you're above the rules. But not here. Not on my watch." A few of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Kane was pushing too far, but no one spoke up. Maya's gaze swept the room, taking in the faces that avoided hers, the eyes that looked anywhere but at her. The weight of their silence pressed down on her, but it only strengthened her resolve. "What are you all waiting for?" Kane called out, addressing the gathering crowd. "See something, say something, right? Isn't that what we're told? So tell me, does she look like she belongs here?" The question hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. Maya felt the sting of his words, but she didn't falter. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, her presence filling the space. "Belonging isn't for you to decide, Officer Kane," she said, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "I belong where my work takes me, and right now, that's on that jet." Before Kane could respond, a sharp chime from the terminal's PA system interrupted the moment. A robotic voice announced an incoming flight, but it did little to break the tension. Maya took the opportunity to issue a final warning. "This is your last chance," she said, her tone steady and unwavering. "Return my briefcase and let me board my flight. If you continue down this path, you'll regret it not just today, but for the rest of your career." Kane scoffed, his bravado still intact, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a brief moment where the gravity of her words seemed to land, yet his pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. "Let's see how that works out for you," he said, his smirk returning as he turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's all wait together and see who regrets what." Maya held her ground, her heart steady despite the storm brewing around her. She knew the truth would come to light, and when it did, the weight of justice would fall harder than anyone here could imagine. The stage was set, and the next act was about to begin. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. The cold hum of air conditioning filled the silence as Officer Kane stepped away from Maya and began rifling through her briefcase with a mix of arrogance and carelessness. His large hands disturbed the meticulously organized contents, flipping through classified documents and sealed envelopes as though they were mere junk mail. Maya's posture was unyielding, her eyes locked on him like a hawk watching its prey. Her face was unreadable, but the tension in her clenched jaw betrayed the fury simmering beneath her composed exterior. "Look at this," Kane muttered, lifting a document stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the United Nations. "More fake credentials? You've really gone all out with this act." His voice was loud, meant to carry across the room and fuel the curiosity of the growing crowd. The terminal staff lingered at the edges of the scene, their faces a mixture of amusement and unease. Some exchanged whispers, their words low but sharp. "She's probably lying about being an ambassador. No way she belongs here. This is going to end badly for her." Maya remained silent, her focus unwavering. She knew better than to engage in the circus Kane was orchestrating. Words would only add fuel to the fire. Instead, she relied on the strength of her presence, the quiet dignity that had carried her through countless moments of adversity. The faint vibration of her phone in her pocket was the only break in the tension. Maya reached for it slowly, her movements deliberate. Kane's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as though he'd caught her in the act of committing a crime. "What are you doing?" he barked, stepping closer. "I'm making a call," Maya said evenly, her fingers already swiping across the screen. "You've left me no other choice." Kane sneered, his expression twisted with disdain. "Put the phone down, now." Ignoring him, Maya raised the phone to her ear. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke. "This is Ambassador Johnson. I need immediate intervention at the East Terminal. My mission is being obstructed, and classified materials are being mishandled. Dispatch my team." Kane's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction with another bark of authority. "Who are you calling? This is my terminal, and you're not making any demands here." Maya lowered the phone and met his gaze, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "You're about to learn otherwise." The crowd around them stirred, sensing the subtle shift in power. For the first time, uncertainty rippled through the onlookers. The weight of Maya's words, coupled with her calm demeanor, planted a seed of doubt. "What if she's telling the truth?" a voice whispered. "Shouldn't they just verify her credentials?" This might get serious. Kane, however, refused to relinquish control. He straightened his posture and barked orders at a nearby staff member. "Call airport security. Let's get her escorted out before she causes any more trouble." Maya watched him, her expression unreadable. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, but there was a quiet intensity in her stance, a restrained force that seemed to fill the room. Moments later, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement shattered the tense stillness. Heads turned as a convoy of black SUVs with diplomatic flags pulled up outside the terminal's glass doors. The scene outside was a flurry of movement, doors opening, men in suits stepping out with purpose, their faces grim and their strides unyielding. Inside, the murmurs grew louder. The onlookers exchanged wide-eyed glances, the weight of realization starting to settle over them. "Is that diplomatic cars? What's happening? Maybe she really is someone important." Kane's smirk faltered, his bravado slipping for the first time. He glanced at the convoy, then back at Maya, who stood unflinching. Her eyes flicked toward the approaching figures, and for the first time since the confrontation began, a faint glimmer of satisfaction crossed her face. The glass doors slid open, and a tall man in a sharply tailored suit strode in. His badge gleamed under the terminal's harsh lights, and his voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Ambassador Johnson," he said, his tone respectful but urgent. "Are you all right?" Maya inclined her head slightly. "I've been delayed," she said simply, her eyes flicking toward Kane. "But I trust you'll resolve this matter." The man turned his gaze to Kane, his expression hardening. "Officer," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing?" Kane's mouth opened, then closed, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I was just doing my job," he stammered. "Your job?" The man's voice rose slightly, enough to draw the full attention of everyone in the terminal. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to profile and harass a United Nations ambassador on a critical mission." The room was deathly silent, the weight of the words sinking into every corner. Kane's face flushed red, his earlier arrogance now replaced with a desperate attempt to justify his actions. "I didn't know she didn't look like—" he began, but the man cut him off with a raised hand. "Enough," he said, his voice cold. "Your ignorance is no excuse. You've interfered with international diplomacy and violated protocols that could have severe repercussions." Kane's shoulders slumped, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He turned to Maya, his mouth opening as if to apologize, but her gaze stopped him in his tracks. "You made your judgment," she said softly, her voice like a quiet storm. "Now you'll face its consequences." As the diplomatic team secured her briefcase and escorted her toward the waiting convoy, Maya didn't look back. The terminal was left in stunned silence, the weight of her presence lingering long after she was gone. Karma had arrived, swift and unrelenting, and the lesson it delivered would not be forgotten. The convoy sped away from the terminal, its diplomatic flags fluttering in the wind. Maya sat in the back seat of the lead SUV, her composure intact, though her fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase. The classified contents had been returned to her, untouched after the intervention, but the sting of the humiliation she'd endured lingered. She stared out the tinted window as the airport disappeared behind her, her mind turning over every detail of the confrontation. The phone in her lap buzzed. Maya glanced down and saw the name of her assistant, Evelyn Marks, flashing on the screen. She answered, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions brewing beneath the surface. "Evelyn." "Madam Ambassador?" Evelyn's voice was calm but laced with urgency. "We've just received word about the incident at the terminal. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Maya said, her tone clipped, "but there's been a breach of protocol. The officer in question mishandled classified documents and attempted to detain me without cause." There was a pause on the other end, followed by Evelyn's measured response. "This will require immediate escalation. Shall I draft a formal report for the United Nations Security Council?" "Not yet," Maya replied, her gaze hardening. "First, I want a full account of every individual involved in this incident. Names, roles, and any recorded footage from the terminal. They need to understand the weight of their actions before this goes higher." "Understood," Evelyn said. "I'll have everything ready by the time you land." Maya ended the call, placing the phone down beside her. The diplomat seated next to her, David Ross, a trusted colleague and ally, finally broke the silence. "They'll regret crossing you," he said quietly, his tone both reassuring and resolute. "But why not escalate this immediately? You could have had their careers ended in minutes." Maya turned to him, her expression unwavering. "Ending careers isn't enough. They need to understand why their actions were wrong. They need to face the consequences in a way that forces them and everyone watching to rethink how they see people like me." David nodded slowly, understanding the depth of her resolve. "A reckoning with purpose." "Exactly," Maya said, leaning back in her seat. "This isn't just about me. It's about dismantling the assumptions that allowed this to happen in the first place." Back at the terminal, the fallout was already beginning. Officer Kane stood in the manager's office, his shoulders stiff and his hands clenched at his sides. Across from him, the terminal manager, Robert Harris, paced back and forth, his face a mask of frustration and panic. "What were you thinking?" Harris snapped, his voice rising with every word. "You detained a United Nations ambassador. Do you have any idea what kind of damage this could do to us?" Kane's face was flushed, his earlier bravado completely drained. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "She didn't look like an ambassador. She didn't look like an ambassador." Harris cut him off, his voice dripping with incredulity. "And what does an ambassador look like, Kane? Do they carry a neon sign that says important person, or is this about the color of her skin?" Kane flinched but said nothing. The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a migraine. "You've not only embarrassed yourself, but you've embarrassed this entire terminal," Harris continued. "And when this reaches the higher-ups, and believe me, it will, you won't just lose your job. You'll be lucky if you're not blacklisted from every security agency in the country." Kane's jaw tightened, but there was no defense left for him to offer. The weight of his actions was beginning to settle, and with it came the creeping realization that his career might already be over. Hours later, in the quiet confines of a conference room at the United Nations, Maya sat with Evelyn and a small team of advisors. The atmosphere was tense but focused, every person in the room acutely aware of the significance of the moment. Evelyn handed Maya a tablet displaying footage from the terminal. The video showed the entire incident. Kane's aggressive behavior, his dismissal of her credentials, and his attempt to open her briefcase. The footage ended with the arrival of the diplomatic convoy, the scene unraveling like a courtroom drama. "This will be submitted as evidence," Evelyn said, her tone professional but firm. "We've also compiled the names of the terminal staff who either enabled or failed to intervene." Maya studied the screen, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up, her voice measured. "Send the report to the UN Ethics Committee. Let them decide how to address this at the institutional level." "And Kane?" Evelyn asked. Maya's gaze hardened. "He'll face the consequences directly. I'll ensure it." Days later, the terminal was abuzz with activity again, but this time the atmosphere was different. News of the incident had spread, and with it came scrutiny from every corner of the aviation world. Reports detailed Maya's status as a renowned diplomat and the mission she had been on, a mission to broker peace in a conflict that had claimed thousands of lives. Kane's suspension was announced publicly, along with an internal investigation into the terminal's practices. Harris, the terminal manager, was also placed on probation for his failure to uphold proper training protocols, but it wasn't just the personnel facing consequences. The terminal itself became the focus of a broader conversation about systemic bias and the urgent need for reform. In a televised interview, Maya addressed the incident for the first time. Her words were calm, but carried the weight of her experience. "This isn't about one officer or one terminal," she said, her voice steady. "It's about the assumptions we carry, the prejudices we fail to challenge, and the harm those prejudices cause. What happened to me is a reflection of a larger issue, and it's one we must all work to change." Her words resonated, sparking conversations across the globe. For Maya, the reckoning wasn't just about holding individuals accountable, it was about igniting a movement toward justice and equality. And for Kane, as he watched the interview from the solitude of his now empty apartment, the weight of her words was a reminder of the consequences he'd never escape. It was a cold, overcast morning when Officer Kane received the letter. It wasn't delivered through a courier or slid beneath his door by some unseen hand. Instead, it came through the mail, folded neatly in an envelope stamped with the seal of the United Nations. He almost didn't open it, assuming it was another reprimand, another reminder of the career he had all but destroyed. But curiosity got the better of him. He slid his thumb under the flap, pulling out the single sheet of crisp paper. The words were formal, each one weighted with precision. "Officer Kane, this correspondence serves as an invitation, not a demand. You are requested to attend a forum discussing systemic bias within institutional frameworks, hosted by Ambassador Maya Johnson. The goal is not retribution, but education, to foster understanding and initiate change. Should you choose to attend, your presence will signify a willingness to confront and learn from past mistakes. The choice, however, is yours." At the bottom of the letter was Maya's signature, her name written in bold, steady strokes. For a moment, Kane simply stared at it, his mind struggling to process what he was holding. An invitation, after everything he had done. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood echoing in his otherwise silent apartment. The room was sparse, stripped of the trophies of his former life. The badge and uniform that had once given him purpose now felt like relics of a time he could no longer reclaim. Across the city, Maya stood in a quiet room at the United Nations headquarters, looking out over the skyline. The forum was only hours away, and the final preparations were being made. Evelyn entered the room, her tablet in hand, her expression thoughtful. "The attendee list has been finalized," Evelyn said, scrolling through the document. "Representatives from multiple agencies, journalists and community leaders. It's going to be a full house." Maya nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "And Officer Kane?" Evelyn hesitated. "He hasn't RSVP'd. There's no confirmation he'll come." A faint smile played on Maya's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. Whether he comes or not, the forum will still serve its purpose, but if he does, I hope he's ready to listen. Evelyn didn't reply, sensing the weight of Maya's thoughts. Instead, she placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, before leaving the room. The grand hall was filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. Rows of chairs stretched across the polished floor, every seat occupied by someone eager or anxious to hear what Maya had to say. Cameras lined the back of the room, their red lights blinking steadily, broadcasting the event to a global audience. Maya stood behind the podium, her figure poised and commanding. She wore a simple but elegant suit, her presence radiating the quiet authority that had become her hallmark. As she scanned the audience, her eyes caught a familiar figure slipping into the back of the room. Officer Kane? He looked different. Gone was the swagger, the air of invincibility he had carried at the terminal. Now he seemed smaller, his shoulders hunched, as though the weight of his actions had physically diminished him. Maya held his gaze for a moment before beginning her speech. When I walked into the terminal that day, Maya began, her voice steady and clear, I wasn't thinking about how I looked or how I would be perceived. I was thinking about the lives that depended on the mission I was tasked with, lives caught in the crossfire of conflict, desperate for peace. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. But instead of focusing on that mission, I was forced to defend my right to exist in a space where I belonged. I was judged not by the credentials I carried, but by the assumptions others made about me, assumptions rooted in prejudice. The audience was silent, their attention rapt. Kane shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor. I'm not here to condemn, Maya continued, her tone softening. I'm here to confront the biases that we all carry, the systems that perpetuate them, and the harm they cause, because if we don't confront these truths, we cannot hope to change them. As Maya's words filled the room, Kane felt a knot tightening in his chest. She wasn't yelling, wasn't pointing fingers or calling for vengeance. Instead, she was laying bare the impact of actions like his, forcing him to see the pain he had inflicted not just on her, but on countless others who had faced similar treatment. After the speech ended, there was a panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session. Kane sat through it all, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. When the forum concluded, he hesitated, torn between the urge to leave and the need to stay. Finally, he stood, weaving through the dispersing crowd until he was face to face with Maya. She regarded him calmly, her expression unreadable. Kane began, his voice cracking. I'm sorry for everything. Maya studied him for a long moment before replying. Sorry is a start, but what matters is what you do next. Change isn't a single action, it's a process. Are you ready to begin it? Kane nodded, his throat tightening. I don't know if I can fix what I've done, but I want to try. Maya extended her hand. Then let's start there. As Kane shook her hand, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. For the first time in weeks, he felt the stirrings of hope, not for his old life, but for the chance to build a better one. Maya watched Kane leave, her heart heavy but resolute. She had seen his type before, people who were products of a flawed system, complicit yet capable of change. Whether he would follow through on his words remained to be seen, but the seeds had been planted. For Maya, the fight was far from over. But as she walked away from the hall, she carried with her the knowledge that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about creating pathways to understanding and, ultimately, to change. The days following the forum were quiet, almost too quiet for Maya's liking. Silence after an event like this could mean many things: reflection, resistance, or even the brewing of something unseen. She knew better than to mistake the absence of noise for peace. Maya sat in her office at the United Nations headquarters, the soft light of a cloudy afternoon casting long shadows across her desk. She was reviewing follow-up reports from the forum, detailed transcripts of the discussions, feedback from attendees, and notes from Evelyn about the immediate impact. It all painted a picture of progress, albeit slow and imperfect. But her thoughts drifted. They often did these days, pulled back to the man who had reluctantly attended the forum. Officer Kane. She couldn't quite shake the image of him sitting hunched in the back, his once brazen confidence eroded to something raw and uncertain. He had apologized a first step, yes, but Maya understood that words were easy. It was the actions that followed that would determine whether change was truly possible. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Evelyn. "Maya," Evelyn began without preamble, her voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "We've just received a request for you to meet with Officer Kane." Maya raised an eyebrow, her pen stilling on the paper she'd been annotating. "Kane, did he say why?" "No specifics," Evelyn replied. "He asked to speak privately. He said it's important." Maya leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She didn't trust easily, especially not when it came to people like Kane, but something about his presence at the forum, the way he seemed to truly absorb her words, stirred her curiosity. "Set it up," Maya said finally, "but on my terms." 2 days later they met in a neutral space, a small private room at a community center in the city. The room was unassuming, with simple furnishings and a large window that let in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Maya arrived first, her posture as poised as ever, her expression unreadable. Kane entered a few minutes later. He looked different than the last time she'd seen him, not just in appearance, dressed casually, without the imposing uniform that had once defined him, but in demeanor. There was a hesitancy in his step, a carefulness in the way he approached her, as though he feared breaking something fragile. "Ambassador Johnson," he said, his voice subdued. He didn't extend his hand, unsure if it would be welcome. "Officer Kane," Maya replied, her tone measured. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit." He did as she asked, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile, more like the weight of unspoken truths waiting to surface. "I wanted to thank you," Kane began finally, his voice rough, "for what you said at the forum. It stayed with me, made me think." Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what did you think?" Kane hesitated, his eyes dropping to the floor. "That I've been part of the problem. For a long time, I told myself I was just doing my job, following protocol, but that day at the terminal, it wasn't about protocol. It was about assumptions I made, about you." There it was, the confession. Maya let his words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "And why now?" she asked. "Why come to me with this instead of continuing to tell yourself those same excuses?" Kane swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "Because I can't live with it anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see your face, the way you stood there, calm, dignified, while I treated you like you didn't belong. It's like a weight I can't shake." As Kane spoke, the cracks in his armor widened, revealing pieces of a man shaped by a system that had failed him as much as it had enabled him. "My father was a cop," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather, too. It's all I ever wanted to be, but they taught me things I didn't question until now. That respect was earned, not given. That you had to watch your back, always assume the worst about people." Maya's expression softened, just slightly. "And those lessons became your truth?" Kane nodded. "Yeah, but they were wrong. I see that now. But seeing it doesn't make it easier to undo. It's like trying to unlearn something that's been drilled into you since you were a kid." Maya leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Unlearning is hard, Officer Kane, but it's also necessary. The question is, are you willing to put in the work?" Kane met her eyes for the first time since the conversation began. "I want to be better," he said, his voice cracking. Not just for me, but for the people I've hurt. For my own kids, so they don't grow up making the same mistakes I did." The meeting stretched on, their conversation delving deeper into the roots of his prejudice and the steps he needed to take to confront it. Maya didn't let him off easy. She challenged him, forcing him to face the uncomfortable truths he had spent years ignoring. By the time they parted ways, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting the room in a warm, golden glow. Kane stood by the door, his posture still hesitant, but his expression more determined. "Thank you," he said again, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Maya gave him a small nod. "This is only the beginning, Officer Kane. What you do from here will matter more than anything you've said today." As he walked away, Maya watched him go, her thoughts a mix of cautious hope and lingering doubt. She knew change was possible, but it was never guaranteed. Still, she allowed herself a moment of optimism, a flicker of belief that even the most entrenched mindsets could be shifted with the right push. The weight of the day settled over her as she left the center, stepping into the cool evening air. The fight was far from over, but in this small moment, it felt as though a step had been taken, a step toward the justice she had dedicated her life to achieving. Weeks passed, each day a blend of progress and resistance. The aftermath of the forum had sent ripples through the city's institutions, igniting both conversations and backlash. Maya found herself at the center of it all, a beacon for those seeking change, and a target for those clinging to the status quo. Her schedule was relentless meetings with officials, interviews with the press, and closed-door discussions with policymakers. But even in the midst of the chaos, she couldn't ignore the lingering thoughts about Officer Kane. His words, his apology, and the glimpse of vulnerability he had shown during their meeting stayed with her, like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading outward. Late one evening, Maya sat alone in her apartment, the city lights painting faint patterns on her living room walls. She held a cup of tea, its warmth seeping into her hands as she stared at the documents spread across the coffee table. They were reports from community leaders and activists detailing the incremental changes taking root in the wake of her efforts. But alongside the progress were accounts of resistance officers defying new training protocols, community members expressing distrust in the initiatives, and most troubling of all, reports of retaliatory actions against those advocating for reform. Maya sighed, her shoulders heavy with the weight of it all. Change was never easy. It was a battle fought inch by inch, often against forces determined to pull everything back to the way it was. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Evelyn. "Kane has reached out again. He wants to meet. Says it's urgent." Maya stared at the message, her mind swirling with possibilities. She knew she didn't owe him anything. His journey was his to navigate, but something about his persistence intrigued her. She typed a short reply. "Set it up." The community center was quieter this time, the hum of activity from the forum replaced by the stillness of an empty evening. Maya arrived early, her steps purposeful but not rushed. She chose a seat near the window, the fading sunlight casting a soft glow over the room. Kane arrived shortly after, his expression more focused than it had been during their first meeting. He carried a folder under one arm, his grip tight as though it were a lifeline. "Ambassador Johnson," he said, his voice steady but subdued, "thank you for seeing me again." Maya gestured for him to sit, her gaze calm but probing. "You said it was urgent." Kane nodded, placing the folder on the table between them. "It is. I've been looking into things I ignored before, things I was complicit in." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents. Maya leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages as he explained. "These are incident reports," Kane said. "Complaints filed against officers in my precinct. Most of them went nowhere, buried under insufficient evidence or dismissed outright." Maya's jaw tightened, her fingers brushing over the papers. "And you're only bringing this forward now?" "I didn't see it before," Kane admitted, his voice tinged with shame. "Or maybe I didn't want to see it. But after what happened with you, after the forum, I started digging, and the more I found, the more I realized how deep it goes. Maya studied him, her expression unreadable. Why bring this to me? Because you're the only one who'll listen, Kane said, his voice raw. I tried going through the chain of command, but they shut me down, told me to let it go, but I can't. Not anymore. Maya sat back, her fingers steepled as she considered his words. She had seen these kinds of reports before, stories of abuse, negligence, and systemic failure. But hearing them from someone like Kane, someone who had once been part of the problem, carried a different weight. This isn't just a matter of filing reports, Maya said finally. Bringing this forward will put a target on your back. Are you prepared for that? Kane's gaze faltered for a moment before he nodded. I don't know if I'm prepared, but I know I have to do it. I've spent my whole career looking the other way. It's time I did something right. Maya leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. If you do this, there's no going back. You'll be seen as a whistleblower, a traitor to the very institution you've served. Are you ready for that kind of fallout? Kane swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. I'm ready to take responsibility for my part in this. Whatever happens to me, it's better than living with the guilt. Over the next hour they discussed the details. Maya explained the steps they would need to take to ensure the reports were handled properly, how to involve independent investigators, how to protect Kane's identity for as long as possible, and how to navigate the inevitable backlash. By the time they finished, the sun had fully set, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Kane looked exhausted, but resolute, as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As they prepared to leave, he paused, his hand hovering over the folder. Do you think it's possible, he asked, his voice low, to fix all of this? Maya met his gaze, her expression both firm and compassionate. It's not about fixing everything at once. It's about taking the first step. And that's what you're doing. Kane nodded, his grip on the folder tightening. Then I'll see it through. As Maya watched him leave, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for him, but for the broader fight she was engaged in. Kane's journey was far from over, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But the fact that he had chosen to take this step, to confront his own complicity and fight for change, was a testament to the power of accountability. Back in her apartment that night, as the city's lights twinkled outside her window, Maya allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The fight for justice was never easy, but moments like this, small victories in a sea of resistance, reminded her why it was worth it. Change was slow, painful, and often uncertain. But it was possible, and that was enough to keep her going. The weeks that followed were turbulent, both for Maya and for Kane. The reports he brought forward sparked a firestorm within the precinct and beyond. Independent investigators were called in, uncovering years of buried misconduct, overlooked complaints, and systemic failures. The revelations were damning, and the fallout was swift. Officers implicated in the reports were suspended, pending investigation. The precinct's leadership came under intense scrutiny, with the chief forced to step down amidst calls for accountability. The media descended on the story, turning Kane into an unlikely figurehead for reform, a role he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but reluctantly accepted. Maya, meanwhile, found herself both praised and criticized. Supporters hailed her as a catalyst for long overdue change, while detractors accused her of destabilizing law enforcement. She met both reactions with the same quiet resolve, focusing on the work that still needed to be done. For Kane, the backlash was personal and unrelenting. Fellow officers ostracized him, branding him a traitor. Anonymous threats found their way to his home, forcing him to relocate under the advice of the investigative team. The weight of his choices bore down on him, but he stood firm, finding strength in the purpose he had finally embraced. One evening, as he sat alone in a nondescript apartment provided by the investigators, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Maya. "How are you holding up?" He stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "It's harder than I thought it would be, but I'm not giving up." Her response came almost immediately. "Good. Remember, this is bigger than you. Keep going." The precinct's reckoning didn't stop with suspensions and resignations. Under public pressure, new policies were introduced: mandatory anti-bias training, the establishment of an independent oversight board, and the implementation of body cameras for all officers. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Kane played a quiet role in these reforms, working behind the scenes with community leaders and activists. His insight into the system's inner workings proved invaluable, though he often felt the sting of his former life slipping further away. For Maya, the fight expanded. The momentum from the precinct's overhaul fueled her efforts to push for broader reforms at the national level. She traveled tirelessly, speaking at conferences, meeting with policymakers, and amplifying the voices of those most affected by systemic injustice. Through it all, she carried the memory of that day at the terminal, a reminder of why she fought so hard. Months later, Maya and Kane crossed paths again at a community event. It was a small gathering, meant to celebrate the progress made and honor those who had fought for change. Kane stood off to the side, watching as Maya addressed the crowd with her usual poise and conviction. After the speeches ended, Maya approached him, a rare smile softening her features. "You've come a long way," she said. "So have you," Kane replied, his voice quieter than hers. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Maya regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I didn't do this for you, Kane. I did it because it was the right thing to do, but you proved that even those who were part of the problem can be part of the solution. That's what matters." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "It's not over, is it?" Maya shook her head. "It never is, but that's why we keep going." As the evening wound down, Maya found a quiet moment to reflect. The journey had been grueling, filled with setbacks and victories, moments of despair and glimmers of hope. But standing there, amidst a room full of people united by a shared purpose, she felt a sense of fulfillment. Change wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about the slow, deliberate work of dismantling what was broken and building something better. It was about planting seeds, even if you might never see them grow to fruition. For Kane, the path forward remained uncertain, but he had taken the first steps, and that was enough for now. And for Maya, the fight continued. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and she was determined to walk it, no matter how long it took. As Ambassador Maya Johnson's private jet soared into the sky, the officer who had tried to remove her sat in silence, his career in shambles and his actions now a lesson broadcast across the world. Justice had been served, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly for how they looked rather than who they were. This story is a powerful reminder. Never underestimate the strength, resilience, and dignity of those you try to diminish. Change begins when we confront prejudice head-on and demand accountability. If stories of justice, empowerment, and hard-earned triumph inspire you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. Together, let's uncover the stories that matter and continue to fight for a fairer world.